There is a photograph from November 10, 1898 that has been sitting in the public record for over a century. It shows a group of men posing outside a building. They are smiling, some are holding rifles. The building behind them is charred. It was, until that morning, the office of the Daily Record, the only black-owned daily newspaper in North Carolina. The men in the photograph burned it down and then stopped to document themselves in front of the wreckage. I keep returning to that photograph because of the smiling, not the rifles, the smiling. These men were not hiding. They had no reason to hide. What they had done was not a crime in any sense that their government intended to prosecute. By the end of that day, the elected government of Wilmington, North Carolina had been removed from power and replaced by the men who removed it. Between 60 and 300 black residents were dead. The number has never been settled because no one with authority to count was ever permitted to try. It is the only successful armed overthrow of an elected government in United States history. For the following 100 years, it was recorded in textbooks as a race riot. To understand what November 10th destroyed, you have to understand what Wilmington had become. By 1897, it was North Carolina's largest city, a working Atlantic port where 56% of the population was black. 3 of the 10 aldermen were black. The county coroner was black. The treasurer, the register of deeds, the jailer, 10 of the city's 26 policemen. The customs collector at the port, a federal appointment, was a black man named John C. Dancy, who earned $4,000 a year. The governor of North Carolina earned $3,000. This had been built through the Fusionists, a coalition of black Republicans and white populists who had won the state legislature in 1894 and the governorship in 1896, and who had reformed election law, lowered interest rates, and made railroad regulation hostile to the wealthy men who owned the railroads. Black families a generation removed from enslavement were running banks and businesses and reading a daily newspaper. The men who lost power when the Fusionists won had not accepted losing. What happened between March and November of 1898 was not spontaneous. It was a campaign. Its architects named it themselves, the White Supremacy Campaign. Josephus Daniels, publisher of the Raleigh News and Observer, put it in print. Furnifold Simmons, chairman of the Democratic Party, organized the machinery. The plan was explicit: restore Democratic power by the ballot or the bullet, or both, and eliminate black political participation permanently. Daniels later described in his own memoir what his newspaper's role had been, the militant voice of white supremacy. He wrote that without embarrassment. The campaign recruited men who could write, men who could speak, and men who could ride. The writers produced fabricated stories about black criminality and cartoons designed for the roughly 20% of the white electorate who could not read the headlines. The speakers, men like Alfred Moore Waddell, former Confederate officer, and Charles Aycock, who would become governor 2 years later, toured the state. The riders were the Redshirts, a paramilitary group who appeared at black neighborhoods and polling places on horseback, armed. What they needed was a pretext. In August 1898, Alex Manly, editor of the Daily Record, published an editorial responding to a speech calling for the lynching of black men as protection for white women. Manly wrote carefully and truthfully that some relationships between black men and white women were consensual. Daniels reprinted distorted versions across the state. Waddell delivered speeches calling for Manly to be killed. A group of 9 prominent Wilmington businessmen, the Secret 9, then formalized the plan. They called their document the White Declaration of Independence. It demanded the permanent closure of Manly's newspaper and the removal of black men from political life. On November 9th, 600 white men assembled at the courthouse and gave the city's black leadership 12 hours to comply. By 8 the next morning, Waddell had 2,000 armed men at the armory. They marched to the Daily Record and burned it. Then they moved through the city. The state of North Carolina commissioned a formal investigation in 2000 and published its report in 2006. 6 years of archival work. What it found had been sitting in primary sources the whole time. The bodies were never counted because no investigation that would have counted them was opened. The commission settled on at least 60 as a defensible floor. Survivor accounts put the number far higher. By late afternoon, Waddell's men arrived at City Hall. The mayor, police chief, and aldermen resigned under armed compulsion. Waddell appointed himself mayor. An elected government had been dismantled and replaced between breakfast and dinner on a single November day. In the following days, prominent black residents and white Republicans were escorted to the train station at gunpoint. 2,800 black residents left permanently, abandoning what they had built across a generation. The banks they had founded closed. Wilmington would not elect another black candidate to office until 1972. What happened to the men who did this is in the record. Alfred Moore Waddell remained mayor until his death in 1905, never charged. 4 weeks after the coup, he published a first-person account in Collier's Weekly, describing himself as a reluctant, nonviolent leader called to restore order. He coined the phrase that would govern how this event was described for the following century: race riot. He painted the photograph. Charles Aycock was elected governor 2 years later. History textbooks called him the education governor. A statue of him stood in the U.S. Capitol until 2020. Josephus Daniels, whose newspaper the state's own 2006 commission identified as primarily responsible for the propaganda architecture of the campaign, was appointed Secretary of the Navy by President Wilson in 1913. He served throughout the First World War. Franklin Roosevelt made him ambassador to Mexico. He never apologized. In his memoir, he described the red shirts with warmth. No one was arrested. No one was prosecuted. The Attorney General's office opened files and closed them in 1900. The word riot is doing a specific job in this history. A riot has no authors. A riot is a crowd, a moment, a loss of control. It assigns blame to no one and distributes it equally across everyone in the vicinity. When Waddell wrote that account in Collier's Weekly, when the New York Times reported that the Board of Aldermen had resigned in response to public sentiment rather than armed compulsion, they were not softening what had happened. They were writing the first draft of a suppression that would run for a century. Some textbooks didn't omit the coup. They reproduced Waddell's version, almost word for word. A 1916 history written by the son of a Confederate officer described November 10th as the correction of Negro rule. Confederate heritage organizations worked to keep that framing in the curricula. The 2006 commission documented this. It used the word conspiracy. The commission recommended reparations. 10 bills were introduced. None passed. In 1896, 126,000 black men were registered to vote in North Carolina. By 1902, that number was 6,100. The suffrage amendment that accomplished this was drafted by one of the coup's architects. This was not a side effect. It was the stated objective from the beginning.